She had a name. You will not find it in any chronicle. No monk recorded it. No king mourned it. It was scraped away like mud from a conqueror's boot. The year is 1204. The city of Constantinople is burning. And in the smoke, in the ash-thick air that tasted of iron and burned silk, 40,000 women vanished from history in a single night. Not in battle. Not in fire. In silence. In chains. In the hands of men who called themselves crusaders. This is not a tale of kings. This is the tale they buried beneath the kings. This is their story. Constantinople. The most magnificent city on earth. A city of 1,000,000 souls, of libraries that held the memory of ancient Rome, of churches whose ceilings dripped with golden light. And it fell. Not to the Turk. Not to the Persian. It fell to the Fourth Crusade, an army of Frankish knights who had pledged, on bended knee, to reclaim Jerusalem. They never reached Jerusalem. They stopped here. They found something greater. Wealth. Women. Power. When the gates broke April 12th, 1200, for the order given was simple. 3 days of plunder. 3 days in which no law of God nor man applied. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, 90 years old, nearly blind, stood at the broken gate and laughed. Inside the palace of Blachany, the Empress Euphrosyne had already fled, taking what jewels she could carry, abandoning her ladies in waiting to whatever fate arrived next. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine chronicler who witnessed the sack with his own eyes, wrote of what he saw in the church of Hagia Sophia. The holiest site in Christendom. Defiled within the hour. Sacred vessels broken for the silver. Altars smashed. Nuns dragged from the sanctuary by men wearing crosses on their surcoats. Choniates wrote, and here his quill faltered, that the women were taken not as captives of war, but as property. There is a difference. Medieval law, even its cruelest provisions, recognized a captive. A captive had value. A captive might be ransomed. A captive had, in theory, a future. Property has none. Among the women seized in Hagia Sophia that April morning, one refused to be taken silently. A widow of a Byzantine senator. Her name lost to us. But her act recorded in a single line by Choniates was not. She screamed at her captor, a Frankish knight of noble rank, the words of an ancient curse. In Greek. In the tongue of emperors. He did not understand the words. He understood the defiance. He had her tongue cut out before the altar of God. What did she know that was worth silencing forever? The women of Constantinople did not stay in Constantinople. They were loaded onto Venetian galleys, ships built for spice and silk, and moved west and south and east. Toward markets. This was not unique to Constantinople. It was not the exception. It was the medieval system working precisely as designed. After every major siege in the medieval world, from the Norman conquest of Sicily to the fall of Anjou, from Acre to Thessalonica, the women of the defeated city became a currency of victory. The price varied by beauty, by age, by skill, embroidery, music, the ability to read Latin. Literacy was worth more than youth, some merchants noted in their ledgers with cold practicality. Those ledgers survive. The women's names do not. In the Norman kingdoms of Sicily and southern Italy, Byzantine women captured in earlier conflicts had been absorbed into noble households, not as wives, not even as proper servants, but as a category the Latin language barely had a word for. They were called ancilli. Bondwomen. The property of the household. There's to command. There's to punish. There's to use and discard. And yet, and here history reveals its hidden seams, some survived. Some more than survived. In the palaces of Frankish lords who prized Greek learning, Byzantine women became tutors. Teachers of philosophy, of medicine, of Aristotle. Their chains exchanged for a somewhat longer leash. Knowledge was the only armor they possessed. And they wielded it with the precision of a blade. But for every woman who found such a fragile foothold, there were 10,000 who did not. The slave markets of the Aegean Sea in the 13th century were, by the account of Arabic travelers who witnessed them, among the most brutal in the known world. Worse, they noted with horror, than anything in Cairo. Worse than Tunis. Worse than Samarkand. Because in those other markets at least there were laws. A seller could be prosecuted for misrepresenting merchandise. A buyer bore legal obligation to the purchased. In the Frankish Aegean there was no law at all. There is a document. A single page of parchment. Preserved by accident in the monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai. It is a letter. Written in Greek, in an elegant feminine hand. Addressed to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The writer identifies herself only as a daughter of the purple, a phrase used by those born in the imperial palace. She writes that she is alive. That she is being held. That she has information about the location of something taken from Constantinople during the sack. Something the Frankish lords do not know they possess. The letter was never delivered. It was found tucked inside a hollow pillar, sealed, unread 800 years later. What was she trying to protect, and who silenced the messenger? Not all women captured in medieval battles were taken to markets. Some were too valuable. Too dangerous. Too knowledgeable about the courts they came from, the alliances, the debts, the weaknesses of kings. These women were imprisoned. An imprisonment in the medieval world was not merely confinement. It was a tool of erasure. Sibylla's story is one among thousands, but it is one of the few where the woman herself left traces. Letters. Testimony from captors who were puzzled, even unnerved, by her composure. She refused to weep. She refused to beg. She asked for parchment. For ink. For a candle. She was denied all three. So she memorized. Every conversation. Every guard's routine. Every door, every lock, every stone that sat slightly loose in the outer wall. This was the silent war of the imprisoned medieval woman. Not of swords. Not of armies. A war of memory and patience. The church had a position on captured women. It was, as with many of the church's positions, complex enough to permit almost any outcome. Women taken in conquest were to be treated, in theory, with Christian mercy, a word that stretched to accommodate almost any cruelty when applied to enemies of the faith. Women taken from Christian cities by Christian conquerors, a more awkward matter, were subject to the laws of the captor's liege lord, which were subject to interpretation, which were subject to purchase. A bishop in Anch wrote, circa 1150, that a noblewoman captured in siege deserved in his judgment the protection of her rank even in captivity. He was ignored. Ignored politely, but thoroughly. Women of low rank had no such ecclesiastical consideration whatsoever. The peasant women of a fallen village. The urban poor of a sieged town. They appear in the historical record in one form only. As numbers. Tallied in victory lists beside livestock. Beside barrels of grain. Beside timber. The women of the siege of Béziers, 1209, the Albigensian crusade, do not appear even as numbers. When the papal legate Arnaud Amari was asked how the crusaders should distinguish Catholics from heretics among the townspeople, he is reported to have said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 people died in Béziers in a single afternoon. Among them, how many women? We do not know. The chroniclers did not consider them distinct enough to count separately. In the tower prison of the Frankish castle at Patras, Greece, in the year 1262, a woman escaped. She had been held for 11 years. She had arrived as a captive of war, stripped of her name, registered in the Lord's records only as Greek woman, educated, useful. She left behind a cell wall carved with text. In Greek. In the dark, with what must have been a nail or a stone splinter, over 11 years, she had written something. Not a plea for rescue. Not a prayer. A history. She had carved, into the stone of her prison, the names of every woman she had known who had not survived. 217 names. Carved in letters no larger than a thumbnail. The castle fell to the Ottomans in 1430. The tower was used for storage. The carved wall was plastered over. It was rediscovered in 1987 during renovation. The plaster was removed. 217 names emerged from the stone. Who was she and where did she go? Some came back. This fact, almost unspoken in conventional history, is one of the most extraordinary details of medieval warfare's aftermath. Women ransomed. Women who escaped. Women who outlived their captors and found themselves years, sometimes decades later, returned to the world they had been taken from. They returned to a world that did not know what to do with them. The medieval church had a canon. Women who had been taken even against their will were considered contaminated. The word used in ecclesiastical Latin was polluta. Polluted. Their husbands, those who survived the wars that had taken their wives, faced a theological and social dilemma of extraordinary cruelty. To take back a polluter was to invite dishonor. To repudiate her was, in theory, a sin. Most repudiated. The women returned to find their homes given to other men. Their children given to other women. Their names, in the local parish records, quietly amended with the notation, lost in the siege. They had not been lost. They had been present, suffering, surviving for years. But the medieval record keeper's instinct was to classify the inconvenient as the absent. The convents of medieval Europe received them. This is, in its complicated way, a truth worth stating. When the world of men had no category for a woman who had survived what they had survived, the church, at its most institutional and impersonal, at least provided walls. A rule. A schedule. A community of women who did not ask questions. Among these convent women, these silent arrivals who spoke too many languages, who sometimes woke in the night crying out in Greek or Arabic, who carved crosses with unusual symbols into their cells, some of the most remarkable documents of the medieval world were produced. Illuminated manuscripts. Devotional texts that hide, in their margins, tiny scenes so small you need a magnifying lens to read them. Scenes of cities burning. Scenes of women in chains. Scenes of ships in dark water. Hidden testimony. Encoded in beauty. Preserved because no one thought to look at the margins of prayer books for the history of war. They could not speak it. So they painted it. And the paint lasted longer than the silence was supposed to. History is not what happened. History is what was written down. And what was written down was written by men who won. The chronicles of the Fourth Crusade celebrate the capture of Constantinople as a triumph of Christendom. They record the weight of the gold taken. The horses seized from the imperial stables. The relics stripped from the churches. They do not record the names of the women. They do not record where the women went. They do not record what the women knew. And yet the women left traces. In carved stone walls. In margin illustrations. In letters tucked inside pillars. In the genealogies of noble families across Europe who bear, if you trace the line carefully enough, Byzantine names that their ancestors brought back from the East along with the women who bore them. The children of captured women became the lords of medieval Europe. The advisors of kings. The abbesses of convents. The illuminators of manuscripts that survive in museums today. Their mothers are listed nowhere. But they are everywhere. In every court. In every bloodline. In every library that preserved a text that should have burned. In the choices of scribes who did not destroy certain documents because a woman, decades earlier, had taught them the value of what they held. They could not stop what was done to them. But they refused in stone, in ink, in blood, in the children they raised in conquered courts to be entirely erased. This was their war. Not of armies. Not of thrones. A war of surviving long enough to be remembered. History carved her out of its pages. But she had already carved herself into its walls.